Right. I know that there will be a presentation on heritage and heritage films, and I won't be uploading this video until that presentation is through, but I know, or I presume, that some students might not be able to attend the seminar on Tuesday morning, and for those who, would like to have a recap or need a reference after the presentation has been done and after the seminar is over, or if you want to write a term paper or anything, that will be sort of a possibility of referencing at least some of the theory that goes with these heritage films. Okay, but let me briefly start. What I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly explain what heritage is, I'm going to explain what sort of heritage films are, and then I'm going to give you a too long didn't watch conclusion of what heritage films are and how I'm using the term heritage film in the framework of this seminar. Okay, let me start. The term heritage derives from both Old French terms as well as Latin terms, meaning both to inherit as well as heir. The word heritage incorporates both profane as well as spiritual meanings, which according to Bill Schwartz's section on heritage in the new keywords can still be found nowadays. In this case, the profane meaning of heritage would simply refer to the simple act of inheriting something, be it money or title or land, etc., etc. Whereas the spiritual meaning signifies a people chosen by God as his peculiar possession. However, generally speaking, heritage describes the transition of customs from generation to generation by tradition, and it is also used to describe everything acquired by one's circumstances of birth. In its broader sense, the term, as Schwartz states, came to be allied with the idea of culture itself, working as a particular subset of the larger domain of the symbolic. Through a widening of the term heritage and its possible applications, the term itself became very closely linked with conceptions of tradition, both of which pose a means for those in the present to organize a historical past. Through the course of the 19th century and the 20th century, both concepts developed even further and are nowadays often used interchangeably. Whereas traditions were, as Hobsbawm and Ranger note, increasingly invented and taken to mean a set of practices normally governed by overtly or tacitly accepted rules and of a ritual or symbolic nature, which seek to inculcate certain values and norms of behavior by repetition, which automatically also implies a continuity with the past, heritage slowly became a commodity, first used to preserve an increasingly disappearing past and later on upholding an image of the past that could never be grasped, known, or experienced. Following the commodification of heritage and the heritage sites in England after the National Heritage Acts in 1980 and 1983, which saw the reconstruction of historic homes and old ruins as touristic attractions, a new genre of movies emerged that was classified as heritage cinema. Heritage films, rooted in British film studios but often co-produced or funded by American companies with a largely British cast, range on the sort of high quality end of film production and can, in general, be defined as a film that places its characters in a recognizable moment of the past, enhanced by the mise en scène of historical reconstruction, often in search of or in order to promote England's own foundational myths, as well as in order to evoke past moments of crisis or triumph. The films reconstruct historical moments which are assumed to be of national significance. The focus of heritage films is usually placed on fictional characters, romantic plots, as well as period spectacle, often using the literary canon as a source material. It is most notably, as James Chapman has noted, that they promote dominant myths about the British historical experiences for lay audiences who generally are not comprised of professional historians, and thus they reconstruct historical moments which are assumed to be of national significance. The past on screen is thus being reinscribed in an original way, with much emphasis on a presumed authenticity and reinterpretation, which reflects upon the time in which these films were made. This reflection prompted Chapman to state that the only reason to make films that are a reflection on history is to talk about the present, as the past in such fictions is never simply the past. They look backwards and forwards at the same time, creating a heterogeneous world that we enter and leave like travelers, in a constant movement of exile and return. However, their display of the past is to be taken with a grain of salt, because history in these films is often infused with popular iconography, reproducing the past as a flat, depthless pastiche where the reference point is not the past itself, but other images and other texts. This distorted image converts these films into mere collages, as each period of the national past is reduced through a process of reiteration to an effortlessly reproducible and attractively consumable connotative style. With the focus shifting away from historical accuracy, the spectacle of the past, the sheer visual splendor of these films and heritage objects themselves become the main attraction. Thereby, heritage films are a cinema of attractions and mediated stories of an already mediated past, rather reconstructions than preservations. Preservations that are mediated and transmitted by generic motifs. These generic images, which are used throughout the entire genre, include a predominantly English iconography of a green, pastoral and pleasant land, as well as an England that is characterized by traditional and even archaic values, featuring largely uncritical usage of images of the empire, for instance. Furthermore, they usually present a largely Protestant Britain and England as leading the resistance to tyranny and oppression. They dramatize the British pluck and courage in adverse conditions. They foreground notable British achievements in fields such as exploration, aviation and sports, and they often devote their attention to the private lives of British monarchs. Thus, their display of England remains reductive, stereotypical, and sometimes even mythical. And instead of being a narrative cinema, they rather showcase sumptuous heritage sites, lavish decor, architectural sites, interior designs, furnishings, and in general, the mise en scène of objects, settings, and period artifacts. Hence, these displays do not operate as narrative devices or forward a characterization, but they carry an ideological effect. They help to construct a sense of Englishness according to a certain bourgeois ideal of imperial tradition, stability and propriety, and thus encourage a nostalgic look back to the certainties and the visual splendor of the national past. Thus, as Andrew Hickson summarizes, their camera movement and filmic style, as well as their narrative, support the grand display of an English heritage culture, transforming the narrative space into a heritage space. The plot of heritage films usually tends to be slow-paced, episodic, and de-dramatized, focusing more on one character in order to create a space in which character, place, atmosphere, milieu, etc. can be explored, resulting often in the disunity of action, time, and place. Furthermore, these films often feature omniscient narration through flashbacks and voiceovers to highlight the film's obsessive fidelity to the source novel. The camera work, in accordance to the slow-paced action, tends to be languid, featuring long takes, deep staging, long and medium shots, and de-dramatized cutting, with fluid camera movements that follow not so much the movement of the actor, but rather offer an aesthetic angle on the period setting and objects through crane or high-angle shots, often absolutely divorced from the character. The camera therefore tracks decorations and objects without narrative motive, but to reveal the splendor. It is this focus on the picturesque and the aesthetic display of objects and symbols, rather than the enactment of dramas, which proves to be both helpful and somewhat problematic when it comes to the heritage film's central function of constructing and reconstructing national identities. Heritage films can usually be seen as a genre centrally engaged in the construction of national identities, which is based on a reactionary vision of the past. As they address contemporary anxieties and incorporate popular iconography, which serve as a reference point for the audience, they also function as so-called enacted utopias, so-called heterotopias, a term that was coined by Michel Foucault in his essay Heterotopia of Other Spaces. And while I have already mentioned heterotopias in the beginning of the seminar, I will now again refer to what a heterotopia is and which function such a term actually has when we talk and look at heritage films. Now, these heterotopias, as I've already said, are countersites in which all the real sites, all the other real sites that can be found within a culture are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. Places of this kind are outside of all places, even though it may be possible to indicate their location in reality. They work basically as mirrors for contemporary audiences who see their own anxieties and troubles acted out in a splendid period setting, and thus they see themselves in the unreal virtual spaces that open up behind the surface and that enable them to see and reflect upon themselves whilst remaining detached from their real self, that is in this case watching the movie. It is this very function as a mirror providing the spectator with a dialogue that turns them into a device to reflect upon, recognize and construct any level of identity. Nevertheless, they of course remain utopias, unreal spaces, as they display a remembered, highly aesthetic, ideal, idyllic and stable past in which, if not all, but certainly most troubles and anxieties are resolved, resulting in their function as a contemporary and modern locus amoenus for the audiences, in which the spectators are free of their troubles for a certain time. Furthermore, these films provide a stage and a space for the reenactment and performance of identity with the help of heritage symbols and generic but distinct pictures of England. However, in this case, we have to take into account that most heritage films were not necessarily made with an English audience in mind, but rather a multinational one. This explains why generic images and pictures of England and Britain have to be used. On the one side, England and Britain have to be recognizable in order to evoke stereotypical images or presumptions about or a certain set of characteristics of the nation within an international audience. On the other hand, however, these generic images have to be used in order to evoke patriotic feelings and affective ties through, for instance, symbols in a national audience. This also illustrates why the distinction between Britishness and Englishness usually fades into the background when we talk about heritage films, as in an international audience, one term is often synonymously used for the other, and of course vice versa. Whereas a national audience might be aware of the subtleties, an international one certainly isn't. Therefore, the Union Jack, for instance, might function as a symbol for international audiences in terms of telling them where the story takes place or where the characters come from, but overall, it stays a mere symbol, a flag for them. In contrast, for a British citizen, the same flag, as it is often connected with celebrations or rituals or national monuments, sporting events or anything else, might actually evoke feelings of warmth, intimacy, home or belonging. For a national audience, these images and symbols are not only recycled within the context of the heritage film, but they also form shared pictures and mannerisms that everyone who belongs to this, in-group basically agrees upon. These symbols, such as the Union Jack or Jerusalem or even the costumes mobilized in these films, are traditional signifiers of Englishness, deeply ingrained in the cultural memory of this nation, a memory that consists largely of images that have by now become so conventionalized that they determine what is a correct representation of a period and a nation and what is not. As most symbols are used in correspondence with national festivities and thus link mere objects to an occasion with emotional impact and a certain script, they are also repeated often enough in carefully staged ceremonies by various institutions of government or education to be transferred from the communicative memory to the cultural memory, as they fulfill roughly the aspects that cultural memory performs and does according to Jan Assmann. And he notes that they are cultivated throughout the years, they are formalized by an authority and a script, they are stabilized through repetition, and they are institutionalized and celebrated on occasion in front of or with large audiences present. Heritage films do not only formalize the English heritage, but they function as an institution of heritage and thus of cultural memory. Moreover, heritage films open up the possibility of nearly endless repetition, which, in correlation to their task of staging and creating national identity, not only eases the way of the transcendence of symbols from communicative memory to cultural memory or one generation to the other, but also in terms of performativity helps to quicken the pace with which these symbols, including newly invented ones and character traits, may become natural. If the heritage film is to be seen as the institutionalization of cultural memory, it serves as an institution of preservation as well as an institution of education and transmission, as it displays heritage objects that have been transferred into cultural memory by repetition and celebration, and it makes the consumption of these objects available for large audiences. This staging of the nation for education and entertainment is a long-standing feature of national culture, but it has primarily been devised to appeal to and instruct domestic audiences. As such, we could say that heritage films actually teach the nation to the nation. Alright, so this video is, I hope, not too long. Why am I doing this? Now, the too long, didn't watch everything conclusion that I have for heritage films. Heritage films construct the nation's history and elevates triumphs of the British into the realm of myth, providing, however, yet another image of Britain that is actually predominantly English, usually positive and often uncontested. It is only through the drawing of stark stereotypes It is only through the drawing of stark stereotypes, the systematic forgetting of the negative circumstances of the time, and by omitting, for instance, social troubles and hardships, thus by avoiding any truly critical contention, that these films actually are able to perform an identity function. Hence, heritage films have often featured other characters, often ideologically opposed others, such as, for instance, Americans, in order to construct a positive image of England and Britain. The heritage film, therefore, also becomes the objectification and commodification and institutionalization of the English cultural memory. The latter not only because of the media, but also because of the link to a British film production company, which the film, celebrating a national triumph, preserves and then transmits. Cultural memory from which heritage derives and to which heritage adds parts is cultivated and scripted throughout the film, and within it stabilizes certain gestures and symbols which are then conventionalized as national representations. Moreover, the film repeats, rehearses, and most importantly performs national identity inside the movie for those on the outside. Within the film, showing off smaller and larger triumphs of the British provides an opportunity for national staging, which is culturally dense and relatively inclusive. Thus, watching these events unfolding on film, both nationally and internationally, may also become a large-scale ritual in itself. For those outside the in-group, it is often the entire film that uses common cultural denominators and shared symbols to paint a distinctively Southern English and British picture, still binding national past and national identity to often upper-class ideas. However, the feature that sets heritage films apart from other films that do similar work in constructing and portraying national identity is their high quality, which lends the representation of the past a certain cultural validity and respectability, and thus a quality that also elevates them to a certain elitist position. Furthermore, heritage films actually draw from and evoke a national past, as it is remembered, that is, and constitute the performative act of remembrance, which is an essential way in which collective identities are both formed and reiterated. Crucially then, national identity, like other identities, is about using resources of history, language and culture in the process of becoming rather than being, answering not who we are or where we come from, but what we might become eventually. Heritage films in correspondence provide nations with a somewhat distorted history that helps to construct identity. Their function as digital, portable, and easily transferable museums is especially significant in a time when nations are threatened by dissolution and globalization, as it is this time during which nations turn towards the inside, towards their own identities, their own heritage, which is incidentally also what heritage films provide them with.